Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 34. High up in one of the 4 towers supporting the Tyne Bridge, Peter Noble, the young man whose job it was to do periodical inspections of the massive supports, was carrying out his duties. But today was different. Today he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 2 men. One was a journalist from a local newspaper, while the other was the manager of a large restaurant close by. The council had welcomed the local newspaper being involved in anything to do with the Tyne Bridge. It was the pride of Tyneside, and any article about the bridge was welcome. However, they had voiced their surprise that a restaurant manager should be quite so interested in gaining an insight in the towers. But Gordon Peterson had explained how his customers often asked questions about the bridge. I simply thought it would be a good idea to learn a little more, especially as my restaurant is so close to the base of one of the towers, he had told them. The idea had originally come from the recent course he had attended. Always try to give the customers what they want, even if it is simply a piece of information about the area. Peter Noble had been delighted to have the 2 men with him that day. It made a nice change to have someone to talk to other than the birds. Though, having already inspected 2 other towers, he was running out of things to tell them. Is there anything you would like to ask me? I haven't said much since we came up here. I don't think so. I guess they are all the same, the journalist said. He yawned. Once you have seen one, you have seen them all. Quiet, listen, said Peterson. I can hear voices downstairs. I thought I had locked the door once they were all inside, Peter said. He tried to look down the stairs by hanging over the steel girders. I can't see anyone. The voices downstairs grew louder. Well, there's certainly someone there, said the journalist. I can hear them now. He turned to Peter. Maybe you should tell those people to leave. If they are injured, the council will no doubt be blamed. Quiet, Gordon hissed. For a moment he thought he recognized one of the voices as that of his cousin. But on reflection, why on earth would David be down there? He shrugged. Obviously he was mistaken. Sorry, he said. I thought I heard the voice of someone I knew. Peter was about to call out to the intruders, but one of them spoke again. Open your eyes. Don't you want to see how it is done? Now Gordon knew he was right. It was his cousin. What was David up to? Was this part of the case he was working on? But when a woman's voice drifted up the stairwell, all 3 men gasped in. So you really mean it? You are going to kill me? Agnes desperately hoped. She had been right earlier when she thought she heard the sound of footsteps higher up the tower. She prayed they would hear her now and call the police. I would like my sons to know that I love them. She continued. I would also like Chief Inspector Alan Johnson to know that it was great meeting up with him again after all these years. She knew she was waffling now, but she was trying to buy some time. Nevertheless, even standing there with a gun pointing at her head, she suddenly realized she had enjoyed meeting Alan. It had been fun and exciting, being mixed up in a murder inquiry, even if it meant she would be the next victim, had given her something to remember, at least for whatever time she had left. Are you done? Drummond asked. He held the gun at her forehead. Can I kill you now? No. Agnes called out. For goodness sake, woman. Drummond lowered the gun. What more is there for you to say? Are you planning to rewrite the history of the world in your dying hour? Upstairs, Gordon couldn't believe his ears. His cousin was down there, threatening to kill a woman. He looked at the 2 men standing next to him. Peter seemed rooted to the spot with a horrified stare fixed on his face. Who could blame him? However, Lowry had managed to gather his wits together. He was already punching the emergency number into his mobile phone. Gordon turned back to look down the stairs. He still couldn't see who David was talking to, though he had a distinct feeling he had heard that voice recently. However, there wasn't time to think about it. If he was going to be able to do anything to stop the killing, he had to get down there, and quickly. He carefully made his way down the stone steps, hoping the grit crunching beneath his feet wouldn't give him away. Drummond twirled the gun around in the air. So what do you want to know now? He was getting bored. This had gone on long enough. You didn't tell me why you killed your brother and sister. They got in the way, David replied calmly. Gordon was stunned. He stumbled and would have fallen if he hadn't caught hold of the handrail in time. He would never have believed his cousin was capable of killing his family, but he had just heard him admit to it. He held his breath, hoping David hadn't heard him stumble. What was that? David stopped swinging the gun around and turned it Towards the stairs. Probably the birds, said Agnes. I understand the place is filled with them. Damn birds. Gordon breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed he was safe for the moment. He wanted to get as close to David as possible before he was discovered. He didn't have a plan. Actually, he had no idea what to do when he got down there. But he knew he had to try to stop David from killing the woman. He heard a slight sound behind him. He turned his head to see the journalist creeping down the stairs. The police are on their way, Lowry whispered. DCI Johnson is already somewhere on the quayside. They're getting in touch with him. The mention of the chief inspector took Gordon back to the day the detective came to the restaurant. He had a woman with him. He recalled she had found his cousin's body in the river. It was then that he realized that the voice downstairs was that of her Mrs. Lockwood. Good, Gordon whispered. Now you should get back upstairs. Are you kidding me? This story could make me big time. I am in this. Whatever. Gordon realized that it was no good arguing. A journalist always put a good story first, and there wasn't time to discuss the issue. The two men crept slowly down the stairs. It seemed to be taking forever. Neither of them recalled it having taken so long to get to the top. Gordon had thought about leaving the small group after seeing the first two towers. What more could there be to learn? He felt he could have won first prize in a competition about anything referring to the towers of the Tyne Bridge. Nevertheless, he had decided to stay with the tour. Now he was relieved he had made that decision. Though, on second thoughts, it could get him killed. He stopped and turned his head when he felt Lowry tap him on the shoulder. What's the plan? Lowry whispered. What plan? I haven't got a plan. How could you plan for something like this? Okay, Lowry grinned. Just kidding. Gordon took a deep breath as he continued down the stairs. This reporter was either a brave man or an idiot. But then couldn't he say the same thing about himself? Drummond had killed his brother and sister. Why would he hesitate at killing him? Shouldn't he be leaving this to the police? Enough. Drummond's voice echoed up the stairwell. I am tired of listening to you. Agnes closed her eyes again. This was it. She was about to die. But she didn't want to see him pull the trigger. She wanted to see the faces of her boys, and her husband, Jim, and Alan. But then she heard an explosion and felt something was past her head. It came from somewhere behind where she was standing. Agnes opened her eyes, hardly daring to believe she was still alive. She found Drummond lying on the floor in front of her. Blood was already beginning to pour from the gunshot wound between his eyes. A few feet away from his outstretched hand lay his gun. Still in shock, she slowly turned around and saw four men standing on the stairs behind her. One she recognized as Gordon Peterson, the restaurant manager she and Alan had interviewed earlier in the week. The other three men she didn't know. One was taking countless pictures of her and the man lying dead at her feet. The third, a young man in jeans and a high-vis jacket, looked like he was in shock. But lurking in the background was a man she knew she owed her life to. He was holding a gun. He had fired the shot which had stopped Drummond from killing her. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 35. A few minutes later, the door to the tower burst open and DCI Johnson was the first to appear. He was quickly followed by his sergeant and several armed officers. Alan was relieved to see Agnes standing there alive and well. Having heard a gunshot as he was approaching the tower, he had feared the worst. He had been worried when he received the call telling him there was someone in the tower who was threatening to kill a woman. No one knew who the people were, but he knew they had to be Agnes and Drummond. His concern had changed to anger as they drove along the quayside to the tower. What the hell was she doing there? Hadn't he warned her about going anywhere near Drummond? Did the woman ever listen to anyone? However, all that was forgotten when he saw Agnes standing there with tears flowing down her cheeks. I thought I was going to die, she uttered. He saved my life. She turned and pointed towards the staircase, but the man had gone. Where did he go? She asked. I didn't even thank him. Gordon and John turned to see Peter a short way behind them, but there was no sign of a man with the gun. Take a look upstairs, Alan said to one of the officers. Though he guessed the man was well away from the tower by now, Gordon Peterson hadn't said a word. His eyes were still fixed on the body. Slowly, he began to make his way down the remaining stairs and would have stepped towards the body if the chief inspector hadn't stopped him. I'm sorry, but you can't touch anything. Our scene of crime officers will be here very soon. Sergeant Andrews had put in the call the moment they had smashed through the door and found the body. Gordon nodded. I understand. Did any of you see the man who fired the gun? Alan asked the three men. They all shook their heads. It all happened so quickly, Peter said. I was the last one to come down the stairs. He must have been somewhere behind me. But where the hell did he come from, and how did he get in? Okay, Alan continued. The officers will escort you to the station and take your statements. Don't leave anything out and be sure to tell the officers where you can be contacted. It's likely we'll need to speak to you again. I need to stay here. It's my job to make sure the doors are locked when I leave. We will see to it today, said Alan. One of the officers led the men out of the tower. Alan, do I have to go to the station? Agnes asked quietly as they stepped out of the tower and into the sunshine. All she wanted to do was to go back to the hotel. By now, crowds had gathered and were being held back by police officers. Cameras flashed as the witnesses strode towards the police cars. John Lowry nodded towards some rival journalists. They might have photographs of the aftermath, but he had caught the action. You will have to make a statement, Alan replied. But then he saw that she was shaking. But I can send a WPC to the hotel if you would rather. She nodded. Yes, please. Alan called over to one of the officers and told him to take Mrs. Lockwood to her hotel. I'll come to the hotel as soon as I can, he told her as she stepped into the car. Back at the hotel, Agnes sank into a hot, scented bath. She had always found it a good way to relax, and today was no exception. She had received a call from Alan to say a woman police officer would be with her in about an hour. Just enough time to pull herself together after her ordeal. She had been foolish. No, it was more than that. She had been damn stupid to follow Drummond. He was trained to pick up when someone was following him. She was lucky to be alive. If it hadn't been for that man, she didn't even want to think about what might have happened. Yet she was going to have to go through the whole thing again when the policewoman arrived. As it turned out, the police officer was very nice. She sat back and allowed Agnes to tell her story at her own pace. She had obviously been trained in how to deal with people who had been stressed for some reason. Agnes had thought she would break down during the interview, but she found herself totally at ease with the woman constable. Instead of it being a nightmare trying to go over what had happened in the tower, she discovered it was actually a relief to talk openly about her terrifying ordeal. It was while she was explaining what she had gone through in the tower that she recalled those terrifying seconds when David was about to pull the trigger. It was then that the faces of her husband, Jim, and their two sons had flashed through her mind. But then she had seen Alan standing some way behind them. Why had he appeared in that fleeting moment? Could it be that he meant more to her than she realized? However, she didn't mention any of that to the policewoman. When the officer left, Agnes thought about it for a while before deciding to go downstairs. In the drawing room, she ordered coffee. At first, she was concerned about bumping into Ahmed, but she got chatting to the waitress who brought her coffee. During the conversation, Agnes learned that one of the bar waiters, called Ahmed, had been arrested that morning. Agnes tried to look surprised. Oh my goodness, why was that? I don't know, she replied. He seemed like a nice man, always willing to help out. But I suppose you never can tell what a person is really up to. That's true. When the waitress was called away, Agnes sat back on the sofa and sipped her coffee. At least she felt safe now. Ahmed was in police custody and David Drummond was dead. For a moment she felt sorry for Gordon Peterson. It was bad enough having two cousins murdered, but to find out that they were killed by their own brother was something else. She wondered what was going on at the police station. Maybe she should have gone there after all. She hated missing out on seeing all the pieces being put together. But thinking it through, perhaps she was better off where she was, and no doubt Alan would fill her in with all the details later that day. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 36. At the police station, the three men gave their statements and left the building. John Lowry couldn't wait to get back to his editor. His photographs would show that what had been going to be a simple story about the maintenance of the four towers supporting the Tyne Bridge had actually turned out to be an exclusive. No other journalist had been there and watched David Drummond being shot in the head just as he was about to kill someone else. Some officer had let Drummond's name slip in the interview room. It was a shame he hadn't managed to get the woman's name, though he did have photos of her standing there with Drummond's body crumpled at her feet. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Gordon just wanted to get back to his restaurant and have a stiff drink. Once television news started broadcasting the incident, he would be receiving calls from other members of the family. What could he tell them? He had no idea that David was responsible for the deaths of Mary and Dennis, nor had he known that David was involved in the theft of a priceless necklace. He had only learned about that while at the police station. No, they hadn't used the word involved. That would have simply made him a part of a gang of thieves. They had told him David had been the thief. As far as they were aware, there were only 3 other people involved, but David was the top man. It was his plan. He carried it out. The others were there merely to help make the plan work. It had been Detective Chief Inspector Johnson himself who had informed him of this news. At first, he thought the police might believe he had helped his cousin in the robbery, especially as he had been in London for a few days. However, the DCI assured him he wasn't a suspect. He had merely taken him aside to inform him ahead of the news broadcasts. He took a large gulp of brandy and looked around the empty restaurant. Maybe it should remain closed tonight. Peter Noble wasn't in a hurry to get back to the council offices. If he hadn't forgotten to lock the door to the tower, none of this would have happened. It could cost him his job. He could have sworn he had locked the door once he and the 2 men were inside. Was it possible that the lock was so old it hadn't clicked into place when he turned the key? That was one of the reasons he hadn't wanted to leave the tower earlier. He had wanted to place the key in the lock and turn it a few times to see whether it worked or not. How was he going to explain it to his boss in the office? He could deny it all he liked, but they would probably see it as the 2 other men had. He had forgotten to lock the damn door. Then there was the other man. The man who came from nowhere, killed the man who was going to kill the woman, and then disappeared. His head was starting to hurt. All he wanted to do was to go home. But he couldn't do that. He had to go to the office and face the music, even if they weren't playing his tune. Alan walked into the interrogation room and sat down. On his right was Sergeant Andrews, and sitting opposite him was Ahmed. A solicitor was sitting alongside Ahmed. Drummond is dead, said the DCI. You killed him? Ahmed asked. No. He was shot dead just before we arrived. How very convenient. We would have preferred to have spoken to him, said Alan, trying to stay calm. But someone shot him before he was able to kill someone else. So you say, Ahmed grunted. Alan slammed his fist on the table. Stop messing me around. This is not a cover-up. There were 3 witnesses who saw the whole thing as it happened. They were trying to get down the stairs to stop him. One was a journalist. He even took photographs. You are in a whole lot of trouble already by your own admission. You assisted in a theft, not to mention you were an accessory to murder. For goodness sake, we have been through all this. Why are you being so hostile now? Ahmed looked down at the table as though he was considering his options. What do you want to know? He asked. For a start, how did Drummond steal the necklace? He didn't tell me everything, said Ahmed quietly. David didn't trust anyone. He only told me what he thought I needed to know. But you helped him steal the necklace. What part did you play? There were 2 guards on duty outside the room where the necklace was displayed in a glass case. You mean the necklace wasn't stored in a vault? Sergeant Andrews interrupted. No, not at the time David stole it. Ahmed replied. There was a special viewing that day. Important people from Europe were coming to see the necklace before it went on display to the public. He chose to steal it after the viewing, but before the necklace was moved back to the safe. Once in there, he would find it much more difficult. Though not impossible, Ahmed smiled. The sergeant gestured for him to carry on. His plan was simple. He went into the room with the officials, but he didn't come out at the end of the viewing. But weren't the people checked as they went in and again as they came out? Alan asked. He sounded exasperated. Yes, they were, but David made 2 identity cards. One was for me, one was for him. Both had the same name and details, but each showed a different photo of the named person. I have to admit he did a great job. They looked like the real thing. He paused, expecting one of the detectives to say something, but they remained silent. Anyway, David hung around until a group of people were waiting to be admitted. He acted as though he was part of the group. The guards hardly looked at his identity card. They just ushered everyone through the door. He looked at the chief inspector. "Can I have a glass of water?" Alan turned around and nodded at the guard at the door. "So what happened next?" Alan asked, turning back to Ahmed. At 2 o'clock the doors were closed, and at 2:30 the guards went off duty and 2 new men took their place. That's where I came in. I ran up to the men and showed them my card. I told them that I was late for the viewing due to a traffic problem and that I need to get in as soon as possible or I would miss the whole thing. "And they let you in, just like that?" asked Andrews. Ahmed threw his hands in the air. "Why wouldn't they? I was smartly dressed. I had an identity card and I had a foreign accent. There was no reason why they shouldn't believe me. Someone down there needs to overhaul the security system." Sergeant Andrews was disgusted that they had got into the room so easily. "So, you were both in the room when the display was brought into sight?" Alan asked. This was taking too long. What happened next? Did Drummond pull a gun and threaten to kill everyone if the necklace wasn't handed over to him? He knew that wasn't the way it had gone down. It would have been all over the papers. There would have been no way they could have kept that quiet. He just wanted this guy to get the point. It was simple, Ahmed continued. When it was time to leave, I made sure I was the last to leave the room. I showed my card to the guys on the door and they ticked off my name on their chart. Meanwhile, David placed himself behind a small screen near the door. Once everyone was clear, the doors were locked. With David still inside, all he had to do was to open the glass case and take the necklace, simple as that. He clicked his fingers. "But that's ridiculous," Andrews exclaimed. He couldn't have simply walked up to the bulletproof glass case and opened the door. "I understand there was a coded lock on it, and what about CCTV? They must have had a camera in the room." Ahmed nodded. "Yes, there were 2 coded locks on the case and both had different codes." He laughed. "Much good they did. As for the camera, David was prepared for that. He had something with him, which he was going to insert into the camera to fool the men watching the TVs." He shrugged. "David tried to explain it to me, but I didn't understand. I don't believe it. It's not possible." Andrews looked at the chief inspector. "You haven't said anything? What are your thoughts on all this?" Alan was thinking back to when he and Agnes were talking to Gordon Peterson. He had said something about his cousin David being a wizard with locks and codes and computers. He hadn't taken a lot of notice at the time, but now it was beginning to make sense. "It is possible," Alan said, slowly. "But even if he did get the necklace out of the case, how the hell did he get out of the locked room?" Andrews was beginning to lose his temper. "Surely, there were guards at the door day and night." "There were? Or at least that was the plan." Alan looked at Ahmed. "That's when you made your second entrance, isn't it?" Ahmed glanced at Andrews and grinned. "Your boss has it." He looked back at the chief inspector. "Shall I tell him, or would you like to carry on?" Alan gestured for him to carry on. "It's your story." Ahmed shrugged. "The necklace wasn't due to be moved until later in the day. Therefore, I was to stay in the building. I had afternoon tea. Then I looked at all the portraits, trophies, and rare books until it was time for the guards to change again. Once the new guards were in place, I ran back through to where they were standing. I started shouting that someone was trying to steal a painting from the wall in the gallery and the security man was being attacked. I told them they needed to hurry. They didn't hesitate. They followed me down the corridor and into the gallery. That's all the time David needed to break the code on the door and get out of the room. Once out, he set the code again and he was home and free." "You're telling us it was as simple as that?" Andrews stood up and paced around the room. "I am in the wrong job. Even an idiot would know that if you have a priceless antiquity in your care, you need better security than a glass case and 2 men standing guard on the door. You are admitting that you acted with David Drummond while he stole the necklace from the museum?" the chief inspector said calmly. Ahmed nodded. "One more thing," said Alan. "How could Drummond know there would be a 2-hour gap between the viewing and the necklace being moved back to the vault? Surely once the viewing was over, the safest thing would have been to remove it from the room." "There was the possibility of another viewing," Ahmed replied. "What other viewing? All the people expected at the event were there. You said so yourself." Andrews had had enough of all this. "There was no one else, Sergeant," said Alan. He was watching Ahmed closely. "It was Drummond, wasn't it?" It was he who rang the museum and informed them another person or persons of importance were interested in seeing the necklace privately. Ahmed nodded. We needed time. If they thought someone of importance was coming to view the necklace, then they would leave it in the viewing room. As far as they were concerned, there were guards outside a locked door. Who was the important person? Andrews asked. Alan looked at Andrews. Who do you think? You don't mean? Alan nodded. I think that just about wraps it up. I'll leave you to finish off here while I go and check out how the other team got on. Earlier, another group of detectives had been out trying to catch up with the men who had bought the jeweler from Hargreaves. It was important they caught him before he had the chance to pass on the priceless necklace to anyone else. They knew that once he heard Drummond was dead and Hargreaves was in custody, he would realize that it wouldn't be long before the police were on to him. It was likely he would panic and try to get rid of the antiquity as soon as possible. So far, the news wasn't good. The police had persuaded Hargreaves to get in touch with this man and tell him he had another necklace to sell. Unfortunately, so far, the man hadn't answered his phone. Keep me informed, and keep trying that damn number. Alan yelled as he strode out into the corridor. We haven't got much time. The news could break any time now. Once that happens, we will never find him. He knew all the loose ends were never tied up on the day of an arrest, but a great deal of money was at stake here. Yet more than that, the reputation of the United Kingdom was at stake. Once it became known that the necklace had been stolen days after it had arrived in the country, not to mention how easily it had been taken, the security of the nation would be the laughingstock of the world. If it was the last thing he ever did, he had to find that damn necklace. He looked at his watch. Did he have time to ring Agnes? He needed to know that she was all right after her ordeal. Damn it, he wasn't going to ring. He was going to go to the hotel and see for himself. I won't be long, he called out to Sergeant Andrews as he passed the office door. I've got my phone. Andrews was about to ask where he was going, but stopped before he had uttered a word. He knew exactly where his boss was going. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At the hotel, Alan found Agnes in the drawing room. How are you? He took off his coat and sat down next to her. Better than I expected, she replied. The officer you sent to take my statement was very kind and understanding. I felt that he's talking to her. She paused. Have you learned the identity of the mysterious man who saved my life? No, and I doubt we ever will. Alan was thoughtful for a moment, but I would hazard a guess that he's the agent London sent up here to watch Drummond. He was still puzzled how the guy knew where Drummond was at the time, unless he had been listening into police radio calls. Or could he have managed to place a bug on Drummond? Who could have got that close to him? At that moment, a thought entered his mind. Terry, the new waiter in the bar. Was it possible he was really an agent? Alan recalled a moment when Terry had brushed against Drummond very briefly when he stepped back to admire the table he had cleaned with such gusto. Drummond had mocked the man, but it could turn out that the waiter was far cleverer than he was. It would be interesting to see whether or not Terry turned up at the hotel ever again. Okay, said Agnes. I realize that there are some things we will never know, but I find it very frustrating. What things? Things like, why was David Drummond running away from the murder scene, said Agnes. If he had shot his brother where we found the blood and then bundled him into the van to dispose of the body, why didn't he get into the van there and then? Why run away? Where was he going? Alan sighed heavily. She was right. Why was Drummond running away? Ahmed had said he was in the van with him. It would take two at least to throw the bodies in the river. Had he been running towards the crime scene and not away from it? Could Alice Thurgood have made a mistake about which way she was facing when she took the photo? Anything else you think needs an answer? I was under the impression Drummond knew the people on the yacht, the one that moored on the quay the morning he was following me. If so, where do they fit into all this? Agnes shrugged. Maybe I got it wrong and he was just interested in the boat. I have to say it really was quite something. Like you say, there are some things we will never know for certain, said Alan. He would speak to Andrews about Agnes's thought later, but for the time being, he wanted her to believe the whole thing was over and done with. She smiled. I was thinking it might be nice to take a walk. I feel the need to get some fresh air. Do you have time to come with me? At that moment, Alan's phone rang. I guess not, she said. Alan answered the phone and listened patiently while Andrews told him that At long last, the man who was buying the jewelry from Hargreaves had answered his call. Hargreaves has arranged to meet him in their usual place, Andrews continued. I gather it took a bit of persuading on George's part, as the stolen items are usually dropped from the hotel windows. They only meet when money is being paid out. He went on to tell the chief inspector where the meeting was to take place. I have to go, said Alan. I know, Agnes replied slowly. She glanced down towards the floor. But then she looked up sharply. Take me with you. What? Alan gasped. Haven't you had enough? You could have been murdered this morning. Take me with you, she repeated. I'll stand across the street. I'll stay out of your way, I promise. But I need to come with you. I want to see this through to the end. Please, Alan. Alan shook his head. There wasn't time for this. Okay, get your coat. But be quick. About 10 minutes later, she arrived in the reception area of the hotel. What kept you? Alan looked at the large handbag on her shoulder. What? Do you need that for? I thought you were only going to get your coat. I thought I might need some money afterwards, and then I wondered whether I might need some credit cards. We haven't got time, Agnes. Come on. Alan ushered her towards the hotel entrance. George meets up with this man near the Millennium Bridge, Alan told her. What do you want me to do? She asked. What do you mean? We agreed that you would stay well clear of the action. Alan replied. He knew from the beginning this was a bad idea. Yet he had the feeling she would have followed him anyway if he hadn't allowed her to come with him. Don't you understand? If George sees someone he recognizes, his reaction could give the game away. It could blow the whole thing. We have one chance to get the necklace back, Agnes. We can't let it slip away. Agnes nodded. Outside the hotel, Agnes stayed on the same side of the street, while Alan crossed the road and sat on a seat near the bridge. There were still a few minutes to go before the meeting was to take place. Alan pretended to look at a newspaper he had picked up in the hotel shop. While he was waiting for Agnes, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a couple of his detectives strolling along the pavement. Some way behind was George Hargreaves, and behind him were another two detectives. So far, it looked good. All the detectives looked like tourists or men discussing business. No doubt, there would be another 2 or 3 men or women on the other side of the road. However, looking around to check it out might only result in him drawing attention to himself. Keeping his head buried in the newspaper, Alan continued to watch Hargreaves as he walked to where the meeting was to take place. His detectives were doing a good job of being discreet. If he hadn't known who they were, he would never have guessed they were police officers tailing a suspect. Now, everything was in place. All they needed now was for the dealer to show. The minutes ticked by. Hargreaves had reached the point where he was due to meet the dealer. George had told the detectives that he sometimes had to wait a couple of minutes before the man appeared, most likely due to the guy being overcautious. Hargreaves stood by the railings and looked down into the water just as he did every time he waited for the dealer to show up. He knew this had to go down. Well, his wife had been to see him at the police station. Tears had flowed down her cheeks when he explained why he had done it. She was so sympathetic. If only he had explained it all to her, they wouldn't be in this mess now. She had promised to stand by him, but she had also told him he must help the police. Alan continued to watch as a man walked towards Hargreaves. The man paused and leaned over the railing and looked down at the river. This could be it. This could be the man who would lead them to the valuable necklace, a coup that would put the Newcastle police force at the forefront. Then it happened, but not at all what the chief inspector had been expecting. There was a traffic accident. A car pulled out just as a lorry was passing. Didn't the driver of the car see the huge lorry? How could he have missed it? Nevertheless, it happened, and the traffic was brought to a standstill. Even though the officers across the road were supposed to be undercover, they abandoned their posts and hurried across to speak to the driver of the car. Alan turned his head for 1 second to see what the commotion was about. But when he swung back, he found the suspect had gone. Hargreaves was alone. Where the hell had the suspect gone? The detectives, who had been trailing Hargreaves, rushed up and placed handcuffs on his wrists. Andrews was one of them. Once Hargreaves was secured, the sergeant hurried across to his boss. Alan stood up and threw the newspaper in the bin in disgust. What the hell is going on? Those people are supposed to be undercover detectives, yet they give up on a case for a minor traffic incident. He roared. The man has got away. We've lost him. Suddenly they heard a loud cheer from across the road. "I don't think we have," Andrews grinned. "Look." He pointed across, towards where Agnes was standing. At her feet lay the man Hargreaves had been meeting. She raised her handbag and waved at Alan. "I don't believe it," said Alan. "I sent her over there so she wouldn't get caught up in the action." "It seems the action seeks out Mrs. Lockwood," Sergeant Andrews replied as they both hurried over the road to get their man. Once the detectives had the dealer safely in custody, Alan turned to face Agnes. "I told you to stay away." "I did stay away," Agnes said. "I stayed over here just like you said. But I wasn't going to let him run past me and get lost in the crowds after all the trouble he's caused." Alan didn't reply. She was safe, and that was all that mattered. But he would give the officers who had deserted their posts a stern talking to when he got back to the station. "I'll finish off here," said Andrews. "Why don't you both go for a coffee somewhere?" Alan was more than happy to do that. He told Sergeant Andrews he wouldn't be long as both he and Agnes strode across towards the cafe by the Millennium Bridge. "It's over," said Alan. "We have the killer, and with a bit of luck we will get the valuable necklace back, together with all the other jewelry taken from the hotel." He paused. "Or at least we will have an idea where to start looking for it." He looked down at his coffee. "What are you going to do now?" He was dreading the answer. He knew she would be going back home at some point, but he hoped that it wasn't going to be too soon. She smiled. "I'm going to stay on at the hotel for a little while longer. There are still some places I would like to visit. I don't seem to have had the time this last week." "Would you like to tell me more about your plans over dinner?" he asked. "I would be delighted," she replied. Shortly afterwards, Alan escorted Agnes back to the hotel and told her he would pick her up at 7 o'clock sharp. Later that evening, as Alan and Agnes strolled past Bessie Surtees' house, he suddenly remembered the person she had seen at the window. "You know, we never did find out who was at the window the night we found the body," he said, glancing upwards. "All the key holders still swear they had the keys in their possession the whole time and were nowhere near the building." Agnes thought about it for a moment. Suddenly she stopped in her tracks. Turning around, she stared up at the window. "Oh my goodness. What is it?" Alan turned his attention to the window, expecting to see someone looking down at them. But the window was shut tight and the whole place was in darkness. "Did you see someone?" "No," Agnes grew very excited. "But I've just had a thought." "What is it?" "On the night of the murder," she continued, "I know I saw someone closing the window. Yet the staff says no one was there." "So?" Alan looked puzzled. "Where is all this leading?" "Don't you understand?" Agnes said. "It can only mean one thing. What I saw at the window that night must have been a ghost," she cried. She looked back up at the window and clasped her hands together. "Alan, this is so exciting. We could do a ghost hunt or something. We could." "Oh no, Agnes, I think," Alan began. However, whatever Alan thought was left unsaid when Agnes linked her arm in his and began to lay out her plan.